So I'd like to create a new video covering some options that we have for connecting your Commodore 64 to a video source. So naturally, some of the things I'm going to need is a Commodore 64 and a power supply. So I thought this would make a good opportunity just to kind of take a look at some of the types of power supplies I've collected over the years. So this is a bit of a strange video, but I hope you enjoy it. So here's a collection of Atari power supplies. These first two are 5-volt DC power supplies. My guess is that they're probably for the XL series. Over here I've got a 9-volt AC and a 10-volt AC. These two, I don't really know what they go to. I'd actually have to pull out my Atari computers to find out what plugs in where. Here's a collection of 12-volt power supplies. The one on the far right is a 2-amp 12-volt power supply. They all use the same, looks like the same barrel connector, but this one's a pretty nice one to have because the 2-amp is kind of on the high end. Most of them are either 1 amp or less. Here's a collection of 9-volt power supplies. Looks like I got a couple of different barrel types. These are 5-volt power supplies. This particular one here came with one of the plug-in TV games, either like a ColecoVision, television, or Atari type style game. They do have different barrel types as well. These are all oddballs. I've got a 4.5, a 13, a 15. This is like a 17 or something. This is actually for an Apple LaserWriter printer. So here I have another collection of Commodore power supplies. They all look very similar, but there are some subtle differences. These two on the left here, they're actually for the Amiga 500 computer. You see they have the power switch right on the front of the power supply unit, the case itself. This one over here is actually for the Commodore 128 computer. This one is a filled unit, so you can't service this one. It's very heavy, where these two are you can open these up and service these. The pinouts look exactly the same, but the Amiga power supplies put out, I believe, a 5-volt and a 9-volt. No, excuse me, a 12-volt output on these guys. This one has a 5-volt and a 9-volt, so they're definitely not compatible with each other. Here's a couple of wires from Atari power supplies. This is for an Atari 7800. It actually broke off the transformer, but it's got such an odd connector, I went ahead and kept it because I can probably reuse an older 9-volt connector and plug in my 7800 with that. And this is for the Atari 2600. Again, this one probably fell off the transformer, and I kept that because you never know when you need that type of connection. So here I have a collection of 4 Commodore power supplies. They all look the same. Obviously, the one on the end here was for the Commodore 64C. And then I have 3 that appear to be for the standard Commodore 64. But taking a closer look at them, you'll notice this one here on the far left has a different type of power plug. It does not have the ground. There's another thing that's a little bit different about it. The power pins themselves are actually located differently. So if we look at the Commodore 64 power supply, we have pin 2 all the way at the bottom, which is our ground. Then we have our 5-volt, and this is our 9-volt AC. But on this guy, we only have 4 pins. So it took me a little while to figure out what the heck I had going on here, because I was trying to plug it in my Commodore 64 and it obviously wasn't working. And then I remembered that the CD32 actually reused a power supply that was originally designed for the Commodore 65. And what's interesting is looking at this one, it actually says PSU C65. And then it has a different model on it, model number, which you'd find on a typical Commodore 64. So the part number on this machine, on this power supply, is 313375-01. Doing a search on that, I didn't get anything back from Google, but then when I looked up the Commodore CD32 pinouts, that was a direct match. Now this unit, I bought a Commodore CD32, probably 2 decades ago, and it didn't work when I got it. I contacted the eBay seller. This is at a time when the stock that had been warehoused in the Philippines had been released, and then I was able to buy my CD32 because the CD32 prior to that really never sold in the US from what I understand. but I was able to get one on eBay a couple of decades ago. It was new, had a bad power supply. The seller kindly sent me a working power supply, so this one's dead. These are notorious for going bad over time. If I take a look at the bottom of these guys, you'll notice that this one looks pretty good. It's pretty flat at the bottom, but these guys over here have a bulge. It's actually bulging out in the center. This one here is not too bad. This guy here is probably better. This is nice and flat at the bottom. From what I understand, the later power supplies were better than the earlier ones, so we do have the earlier ones here. I'm going to test these and see how they work out on a multimeter before I plug them into a Commodore 64, because I have done damage to older Commodore 64s with these power supplies. So I'll just set that one off to the side. Next thing I want to do is go ahead and test the voltages on these 3 power supplies and see what I get out of it. So testing the voltages on the pins is a little tough because you got to try to get your oscilloscope in there to test it. I'm going to put this on testing voltage, and holding this and holding these 2 things without a set of helping hands, I just can't do it. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to leave my C64 off. This particular board doesn't have a processor or SID chip in it. It's got the RAM, but I'm not too worried about this board right now. But I'm going to leave it off just so that I'm not running power through it. But what I do want to do here is take advantage of having the board plugged in so I can take measurements of voltage off the board itself. So that's pretty easy to do. What I'm going to do here is I'm going to find my ground, just like that. And then I'm going to connect, I want to get the 5 volt and see how that's looking. So that's this pin right here. And when I hold it, I've got a steady 5.22 volts. And the other pin should be exactly the same. Yep, steady 5.22 volts. Now I'm going to switch my multimeter over to measure AC power. And I'm just going to connect the 2 top pins here. And I have 10.74 volts. And it's pretty steady. I've had these power supplies plugged in all night long. Now feeling the temperature just on the top of the power supply, this one's a little bit warm, but not hot. Second one's warm, and the third one's warm. Okay, so now I'll go ahead and plug in my next power supply. This one's running 10.89 or 10.9 volts. So this might be a little high. I'm going to have to look up to see what safe voltages are for the Commodore 64. .24 volts. Switch it over to AC. .48 volts. Okay. Now the one thing I'm not doing here is I'm not measuring how these transformers hold up with a load on them, but I'm just going to use them for a short period of time, so I'm not too worried about it. So in my next video, I'm going to go ahead and pull out the Commodore 64 and some various different types of connectors, and we'll go over how to connect your Commodore 64 to some sort of video output.